I'm Jake Tween and I'm Head of Apprenticeships with DSW, and we're very kindly joined by Marcus Bauscher today, who's MD at FWD Training. And the reason we asked Marcus to join us is that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about focusing on today is around shortening not only the on-program piece of learning, but in particular the endpoint assessment window. So once the apprentices have got through Gateway, and I know that Marcus and his organisation are particularly good at that part. So what we really wanted to do was to identify what are kind of the common traits and the behaviours, if you like. What do you need to do as a training provider in order to try and shorten that window? So hopefully Marcus can kind of shed some light on some of the practices that he does to get there, obviously without sharing anything kind of commercially sensitive, but really some of the key lessons that they've learned over the journey of the past couple of years and what's worked well and what they've done in order to properly prepare and plan to make the endpoint assessment experience as efficient as possible. Okay, so a little bit about me. I shan't dwell on this, but I've worked in the education and skills sector now since 2006. I've worked for a couple of the very large awarding organisations, so doing a range of things from quality assurance, primarily really around designing qualifications and assessments, including apprenticeships and functional skills. So it was quite a natural transition for me when we moved from the frameworks into the world of standards. And my role for the last sort of 3 or 4 years now has been supporting employers and training providers and apprentices in that transition, and understanding how we can work together to make sure it's an enjoyable experience and also that we have successful outcomes for everybody involved. Now, hopefully Marcus will be able to introduce himself. And I'm working from home today, and Chelsea's in the office, so she's kind of facilitating us from a technical point of view. So hopefully we can get a word from Marcus now.
Hello, everybody. Delighted to join this morning, and happy to share some of the things that we've found that have worked for us over the last couple of years. Lots of lessons learned along the way, but very happy to share that with you. Just very quickly, as it says on the slide, FWD specialise in financial services apprenticeship programs. We got on board with the new standards at a very early stage. We decided to embrace it and go for it almost from day one, really. So hopefully that means we've got some good experience to share with everybody. And I guess the other thing that helped us was, prior to getting involved with FWD, I was involved as a consultant working with the employer Trailblazer chairs, basically developing and getting approval for the new standards. So I had a good idea of what the new world was going to look like and how assessment plans and EPAs were going to work. So happy to answer any questions or add comments as we go through. Back to you, Jake.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Marcus. So yeah, if people do have questions, we've kind of muted all the delegates because otherwise it can become quite chaotic. So please do use the chat function and post any questions you've got throughout. What we'll try and do is kind of answer them as we go through. It might be easier if we sort of bank them all and have a Q&A at the end, just thinking from a facilitation point of view. But certainly, generally, when we do these webinars, we get a lot of questions and more than we can answer in the space of time that we've got. So we're more than happy to sort of take those questions offline and send a group response, or to kind of communicate on an individual one-to-one basis with anyone that's got specific questions around their own organisation or their own apprentices. Okay, so a little bit about DSW. So we are one of the fastest growing endpoint assessment organisations in the UK. We specialise primarily in the financial services sector, but we are sort of starting to branch out now, which has really been in response to customer demand. We set up as an organisation primarily as an L&D consultancy firm 20 years ago. It's our 20th anniversary this year. What that meant was that we were working with a lot of large sort of FTSE 250 clients, mainly in the city and across the financial services sector. And then when the apprenticeship levy came in, obviously that changed a lot of the behaviours with employers and the way that they approached L&D and the way that they funded it. So a lot of employers came to DSW and said, well, we've been working with you for a long time now in terms of devising our L&D strategy and rolling that out. So actually, we'd like to continue working with you as an endpoint assessment organisation for our apprenticeship services. So that's really how we arrived where we are now. Same as what Marcus described. It's been a learning curve, a lot of lessons learned along the way. I think this year, it's fair to say, we've been really the first year that endpoint assessment's been truly tested for us as an organisation, but also nationally. It's the first year we've had really particularly large cohorts going through and doing things in volume. But it's been a thoroughly enjoyable experience. I think on the whole, most people have kind of got it right. But there are some really excellent pieces of good practice that we've picked up on, and those are some of the things that we wanted to cover off in the webinar today. Okay, so 3 key kind of aims of the session, I guess. First one is understanding why is timely completion so important? And there are a lot of reasons, which we'll go into. We wanted then to look at the strategy and the tactics and crucially the behaviours of organisations that do this successfully. By successfully, I mean who can complete in a timely manner. Not only that, but actually complete within the time frame that they kind of set from the beginning. And third, we wanted to allow you to go away with some tangible actions that you can take back to your organisation and say, okay, we can take these steps in order to hopefully improve and reduce the time taken to get to Gateway, but then also the time taken to complete the endpoint assessment. Okay, so 3 key sections. First, we're going to look at some data. So we carried out a piece of work throughout the summer where we looked at the data coming through in terms of apprenticeships completed, and we looked in particular at how long apprentices were on programme and how long they were in the endpoint assessment phase. And we're able to filter that data by training providers, by skills coaches, by DSW assessors, by standard and by employer. And we found that actually the data pretty much backed up what we suspected anecdotally, which is quite reassuring. And then that data has really allowed us then to drill down and to speak to individuals and say, okay, well, how did you manage to do it in such a short period of time, while still maintaining successful outcomes and a positive experience? So first of all, we'll have a little look at the data. Then we look at that issue, why is it so important to complete in a timely fashion? And then we look at the effective behaviours. And actually, I think it's a mistake to think, okay, well, in order to have a quick EPA period, you just focus on that actual EPA period itself. I think what you need to do is take a holistic view of the whole apprenticeship, and there are steps that you can take from day one during the on-programme phase, and then also at the gateway phase, and then lastly the endpoint assessment phase. And really, that planning is the critical element of it. So as we go through, I'll invite Marcus to kind of share his experiences with us. But Marcus, if there's any point where you feel like you'd like to input, then feel free to talk about any point.
Jay, can I just quickly come in there before you go into those three sections? It may be an obvious thing to say, but one of the things that we concentrate and have concentrated more and more on is talking about the whole program, and in particular what endpoint assessment looks like, what the assessment methodology is, what the requirements are, right from induction. So our induction now with apprentices looks at all aspects of the program as you'd expect. But I think it's fair to say from 2 years ago to now, one of the things we've realised is how much more time, which is well spent, that we should have placed on really getting them to understand what the end looks like as well. And that's important for 2 things, which I'm sure Jake will pick up on. Partly because obviously the apprentice needs to know what's required of them, but also from the employer's perspective, they need to understand what the whole program looks like and be committed to the whole program. But I'll come back in and talk a bit more about the individual bits as we go through.
Fabulous. Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so the key headlines, I guess, that we took away from the data analysis that we did is that there is actually quite a significant difference from one training provider to another in terms of how long it takes. Interestingly, in terms of the on-programme phase, there is no correlation between the size of the training provider and the amount of time it's taken them to complete the on-programme phase. But there is, interestingly, it appears a correlation between provider size and how long it takes to get through the EPA stage, and we'll look at a couple of graphs in a moment. what backs up our theory that it's the behaviours is really the fact that if you have a training provider that completes one particular standard quite quickly and with successful outcomes, that trend seems to be repeated across that training provider. So if we have a training provider who's offering level 2 right the way through to level 7, they tend to be really good at doing all of it. Conversely, if we have a training provider who can take quite a long time, then that seems to be replicated across their whole portfolio. So I think that backs up the theory, if you like, which we suspected anecdotally that actually it is the behaviours. So it is the steps that the training providers take in terms of planning, liaising with all the stakeholders that really kind of can make the difference. There are always outliers, and it tends to be with individual employers. So it would be, for example, a training provider who gets things done really, really quickly in general, and then you'll see a spike in the data. And when you look at that spike, it generally tends to be with one employer client. But actually, we think that's probably quite useful data for training providers, because then that kind of flags with you, well, there must be something to do with that relationship that's causing it to take much longer than it is with any other client. And once you have that data, it can kind of empower you to then start thinking about, okay, well, how do we liaise better with them? How do we identify what the issues are? And actually, how do we prevent them from happening again? Not just with that client, but with any clients. So if any of you are on the webinar today and you are customers of ours and you're interested in looking at the data for your organisation, get in touch and we'll be more than happy to share that with you. And the final point is that actually, again, something that we suspected, when you look at the pure financial cost alone, the cost of delayed on-program, the cost of delayed endpoint assessment is significant. Okay, so the first piece of data, if you like, so we looked at particularly the insurance practitioner standard. So this is a level 3 standard. It's expected to last between 12 and 18 months on program. And then the assessment plan states that the endpoint assessment period is 5 months. So when we looked at the data, there's quite a discrepancy in terms of the on-program duration. So the best performer, if you like, so the ATP that got them through the quickest did it in 60 weeks, which is kind of bang on what you'd expect. And the worst, for want of a better term, so the one that took the longest, took 78 weeks, which is quite a bit longer than the expected duration, which is taken from the assessment plan. What's interesting there, so if you look at the graph, so the size of provision indicates kind of the size of the training provider, if you like, in terms of how many apprentices they've got. Obviously, we took the figures out of there because we didn't want to release any kind of commercially sensitive data. But what it does show us is that of the two largest training providers in that data set, one did it in the shortest period of time and one did it in the longest, which is why I was saying in terms of on-program, there isn't really a correlation. So you can't necessarily say, okay, if you're a big training provider, you can get them through on-program much more quickly, nor can you say if you're a small training provider, you can get them through much more quickly. I think it really depends on actually the way that the training provider approaches endpoint assessment and how they plan for it, rather than their size and the number of apprentices that they've got on the books. Okay. So the next one is the average gateway duration, and by that we mean actually the time from when they were signed off on gateway to them actually completing their endpoint assessment. And the best performer, if you like, did that within 5 weeks, and the worst did it within 19 weeks. And this is where we see the two largest providers in this particular data set. They both did it. They both took longer to complete EPA. So, as I say, we just started gathering this data and analysing it in the summer. So we're going to keep an eye on that trend and see whether that's kind of borne out over the next sort of 12 months and beyond. And if it is a case that it takes larger training providers longer to get them through EPA, that's something that we'll work with training providers on to identify why might be the issue, and what can we do to overcome that, and actually share that good practice across the sector. Because I think one of the things that we've come to is that I think timely completion is really important for us as a sector as a whole. There are a lot of stakeholders involved. Some of the assessments are very complicated, so I think it's quite a difficult thing to get right. But I actually think it's in the interest of everybody involved that we try and do this as efficiently as possible. So we would very much encourage kind of one-on-one conversations, and we'll continue to look at this data and use this data so that we can work collaboratively to make it as efficient and as good an experience as possible for apprentices and employers and training providers and endpoint assessment organisations too. So this was an interesting figure. So when we looked at taking, say, a training provider that has 1,000 apprentices, so not massive but fairly large. Excuse me. So we calculated that a training provider of that size who delivers it in 19 weeks less than the average saves a minimum of £320,000 per year. And that is actually based only on the cost of a skills coach, based on a £27,000 per year salary. So in actual fact, the savings probably quite a bit bigger than that. So we think that that's quite a useful stat. So even if you're working in a training provider and you're not the person that's necessarily responsible for the finances, it's quite useful if you're able to prove that you can take steps to shorten that window, and in doing so, you save in your organisation quite a bit of money actually over the year. And it's quite interesting, I think, that when we look at the cost of EPA, if you like, I think there's a tendency to look at that headline figure. So, okay, what is the cost of registration per apprentice? But then when you look at the kind of the peripheral stuff, and in particular these delays to the endpoint assessment period, that's where the kind of hidden cost of endpoint assessment is. So I think it's really important and really useful to be aware of that, and then to take steps to make sure that that's reduced as far as possible. And that's it from a data point of view. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Marcus, before we look at the next section.
Not from a data perspective, just to pick up on something you were saying about, the how it's important for the sector for us to get good at this. I think everybody probably knows that one of the big things that we've been working, I'm sure you guys have as well, really really hard on, is the whole apprenticeship brand within financial services. Which has had its challenges, and I think gradually we've started to make some big inroads into that. And it's things like delayed endpoint assessment or confusion about endpoint assessment or losing interest in endpoint assessment. These are the things that can really damage the brand after, frustratingly, a lot of all the really good work's been done in on-program learning. So I just think that's probably something else that is worth bearing in mind, that this sort of is almost the key bit, really, to making sure that we keep that brand really strong and people enjoy the program and complete it right through to the end.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, I think from my experience of working with a variety of training providers and employers, I think where everybody's bought in and they understand actually the impact that a successful apprenticeship outcome can have on the individual and on the organisation, and when they really sell that and promote that internally, I think that makes a huge difference. I think you're quite right that particularly in FS as a sector, there's quite a stigma, I guess, attached to the notion of apprenticeships due to kind of outdated views of what they are and who they're for. And I think the language that we use and that employers in particular use actually in terms of promoting apprenticeships within their business is really important. So that was just a little look at the data. Like I say, we're more than happy to speak to kind of individual training providers or employers to share pertinent bits of your data and discuss how we can work collaboratively to make it as efficient as possible. And now we'll have a little look at, okay, why is it important to complete on time? And actually, I think it's fair to say that timely completions are of a benefit to absolutely everybody involved. Obviously, from an endpoint assessment organisation point of view, we want to get people through as quickly and as efficiently as possible. From the training provider point of view, it can save you a lot of money. From the apprentice point of view, this is kind of the critical moment for them. And as Mark's just mentioned, it's really important to the brand of apprenticeships, actually, that it's seen to be a positive experience and that it's sleek. And where there are kind of delays or bad experiences, then obviously apprentices, they'll go back into their organisation and they'll talk to other people and say, well, I didn't have a very good experience. So it's in all of our interest to protect that brand, to kind of try and work as collaborative as we can on this. And it's in the interest of the employers as well, because actually once the apprentices got through their own programme phase and have been signed off for Gateway, most employers are just desperate to kind of get them back on the shop floor, if you will, so they can be being productive and sharing some of the skills and some of the knowledge that they've developed while they were on program. Increased capacity, I think, is also critical. So if as a training provider you're putting apprentices through and then you're getting them through kind of right on time or sometimes even kind of ahead of schedule, what it means then is the resources that you've got allocated, so for example your skills coaches, well actually they can be used to support more apprentices, so you could potentially bring more apprentices on board. Or what you can do is you can use that talent to kind of support other apprentices that are still in the system, start looking and reviewing kind of processes and systems and IQing and all those sorts of things. More engaged, focused apprentices, so for the reasons that we kind of looked at before, I think apprentices are much more engaged when they're aware of what's happening, they know how they're going to be graded, they know what they're being graded against, and they always have more successful outcomes, and they always then speak very positively about the apprenticeship experience across their organisation. The success rates are higher because I think once you get through that kind of on-program and once you go through Gateway, that's really the critical point, and that's where you've got to get it right and you've got to actually have targets to stick to them. And I think from a training provider point of view, lastly, it's really important to complete on time because it makes you much more attractive to an employer, particularly if you've got the data to back it up and saying, okay, well, on average, actually, we do this very efficiently. Compared with our competitors, we can do it in sort of 60, 70% of the time, for example. And then being an organisation that, you know, is true to their word and that works effectively and has a real kind of polish to you, that's invariably going to invite more employers to want to come and to work with you.
So the other thing I'd add as well is that we have a lot of apprentices that want to progress, having completed for instance, their certificate level practitioner. So again, one of the things that can really upset apprentices and employers is if they're held back from taking the next exams, if you like, which can be part of the diploma or the advanced diploma level program. So again, it's just yet another reason why you need to be super efficient on the endpoint assessment, so that if they do want to progress quickly, they can do so.
Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so we've got just a few more slides now, and conscious kind of want to allow a little bit of time to answer some of the questions at the end. I've noticed quite a few popping up in the comments. Hopefully you can keep an eye on those, Chelsea, but certainly I'll have a look when we're finished. So really I wanted to break it down. I mentioned before that I think if you want to have a timely endpoint assessment experience for everybody, it's important not to just think of that post-gateway period. I think it's really critical to start building, as Marcus said at the very start, is to start building in your plans for endpoint assessment as soon as you've inducted the apprentices, and that's 100% is the most efficient and effective way to achieve that. So if we look particularly at the on-program phase, early engagement with the endpoint assessment organisation, if there's one piece of advice I would want everybody to take away and follow, it would be that, because without a doubt, those ATPs and those employers that have engaged with us early and started those conversations early always have a more successful outcome. It always runs much more smoothly, and the assessment kind of takes a shorter period of time, basically. And by early engagement, we mean recognising that tripartite arrangement. So in many ways, the training provider and the endpoint assessment organisation are providing two parts of the same service. So really, the apprentice is the ultimate customer, the apprentice and their employer. And so I think, why is it important to engage early? I think the conversations that we have when we engage early are really useful, because what we can do is we can look at the real detail behind the assessment plan and actually what our approach to that is as an assessment organisation, because a lot of the assessment plans are very nuanced, they're quite complex, there are rules of combination in there, and because of that, it means it's not really safe to assume anything. So engaging early and having a conversation with us. So, for example, what we do at DSW, typically, if we get a new training provider or somebody offering a new standard, we'll offer them a webinar session or kind of an interactive WebEx session. And sometimes that might just be the training provider and DSW. Quite often they'll bring the employer in as well. And I think it's just really useful for setting the scene, explaining why the endpoint assessment's important, but then also sharing information on, okay, well, what's going to happen? What does the timeline look like? what are the assessment methods, what resources are available in terms of mock assessments and practice materials and all those sorts of things. And kind of having sight of that early on allows you to plan much more effectively, and it just means that there isn't a big panic once you get to Gateway if the apprentices are kind of not even aware of what's going to happen. That can be quite damaging. So working with the endpoint assessment in mind, and by that I don't mean teaching to the test, because I think with this the nature of this kind of assessment, you can't really teach to the test anyway, but actually there are a bunch of resources that you can use to make apprentices aware of what the assessment is likely to look like. So for example, for all of our standards, we'll provide a toolkit, and within that we'll provide a referencing table. And I would always advise sharing that referencing table with the apprentices, because in there it shows them what the detailed learning outcomes are that they're going to be assessed against. And quite often it will describe what a pass looks like, and it will describe what a distinction looks like. So if you've got apprentices who are kind of engaged early on and they've had sight of that, well, if they're developing kind of a portfolio of evidence as their own program, then they can be aligning that, and then they can, if they're familiar with those learning outcomes, if they go into a professional discussion or if they go into an interview and they've got those outcomes fresh in their mind, they're going to be much more likely to be able to respond to questions in a way that gives the answer that the assessor's looking for. I think setting and monitoring targets is really important, and using formative assessment. So in the world of frameworks, it was all about formative assessment, really, and that was one of the criticisms, I guess, that led to the development of standards and endpoint assessment, was that, well, this formative assessment meant you could just coach people through and you could do it iteratively and give them as many chances as they wanted until they got it right. But what we shouldn't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater and lose all of that good practice, because actually I think formative assessment's a really useful tool in terms of kind of ensuring that an apprentice is on track. So setting them goals and monitoring them against those goals. And actually, if you've set a particular Gateway date in mind and you're running these diagnostic tests as they go through and using formative assessment, you're going to be able to build a really clear picture of whether or not a person's likely to hit. And if they're not likely to hit, well, do you build in more learning opportunities, or do you push that Gateway date back? But I think it's really important to keep monitoring that and actually communicate with your endpoint assessment organisation as well to let us know, and we can work with you on that one. 20% off the job, we could do a whole week session about 20% off the job, but I think in terms of the on-programme piece at least, it's absolutely critical that that's managed effectively and planned in from the start. And again, monitoring of that is so important, because if that starts to slip, it becomes increasingly difficult to catch up, and that 20% all of a sudden is 21%, 22%, and it goes up and up and up. And that's particularly true, I think, once the apprentice has gone past the Gateway date. So if you had a Gateway date of the 1st of September, as soon as they go past that Gateway date, they're still technically on programme, so they're still required to do the 20%. And if they were only at 10%, every day that they're on programme, it gets more and more difficult actually to get them up to that 20%. And one of the bits of advice that we always give is actually, when you're inducting the apprentices and when you're planning the programme, and try and do as much of that off the job as you can early on, because it means you've got it in the bag, and if things do change and if business requirements take over, which they always do, you're not at risk of kind of slipping, because they can disappear into a black hole, if you like. And there are a number of apprentices on the books for all of the endpoint assessment organisations that I've spoken to who are kind of in that limbo where they've gone past the Gateway and they're kind of forgotten about, and it's very difficult to support them. So try and get that right early on, I guess, is it. And the last thing I think is a really kind of starting and ending with the two most important points there. I think engaging early with the endpoint assessment organisation is critical, and empowering the apprentices is absolutely critical as well. Give them the ownership over it so they know what they're going to be assessed against, they know what the process looks like, and they've got ample opportunities to prepare themselves for that experience.
And Jake, just to comment again, I was going to, the bit you said about the formative assessment, I think is absolutely critical. And I think what we've heard perhaps other training providers have done in the early days is to sort of default to almost looking after exams on program learning, and then sort of worrying about the portfolio and the assessment of competencies towards the end. One of the things I think we've always tried to do is to impress upon the employer from day one. There's two things that need to be done by the apprentice in order to pass the program, and they need to go hand in hand from day one. So we start building a portfolio in inverted commas from day one. Understanding that evidence can't necessarily be used at the end, but it just gets everybody used to how to do that, gets the apprentice used to doing it, enables the coach to monitor the performance, see what levels they're at, etc. And then you can convert that into sort of a showcase version at the end, if you like, according to the assessment plan rules. So I think it's a question of embracing both of those things as you go through the program.
Perfect. Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so the next stage is gateway, which is an absolutely critical stage as well, because actually it's kind of not to put doom and gloom on it, it's the point of no return, I guess. So I think it's important to be absolutely certain that when you're signing off an apprentice for gateway and EPA readiness, that they're truly ready. Because if you think they're half ready and okay, well, we can continue to kind of get them there in the EPA period, it's very, very difficult. So it's really important that once you've got to that gateway, you understand what it is that you're signing them off for. So the basics are the knowledge, skills and behaviours. So actually, have they been able to demonstrate those? Have they been able to apply the knowledge that they've learned in the workplace? But then I would advise that you go more granular and you look at the referencing tables that I just mentioned in the toolkit. So in particular, I always advise people to look at the verbs. So, for example, in the knowledge section, if you've got verbs that are saying, okay, you're going to need to be able to explain different models of leadership, for example, can that apprentice actually explain different models of leadership? And it's not good enough for them to just list them or to give one example. There's a plural in there and the verb says explain, and it sounds really obvious, but I think that a lot of people kind of don't focus on it in that level of detail. So really make use of those resources and test the apprentice against the literal definition of what it's saying in that standard. Can they do it? Have they demonstrated that they can do it? Using mock assessments, I think, is really important. And quite often people will just use mock assessments once they've gone through Gateway, but actually there's no reason that you can't use them before they get to Gateway. And it's quite a good diagnostic tool, I guess, in terms of what quite often happens is you have an apprentice who's actually brilliant at their job. They're really good. Their employer thinks they're really good, but they haven't understood what it is that they're going to be assessed against. So I guess the message is it's not necessarily good enough to just be good at your job. You are going to be assessed against a standard, so the apprentice needs to know what that standard is. They need to know what that assessment looks like. And the mock assessments are a perfect way of making sure that they're at that point. So if they're approaching Gateway and they're a month away and you think, yeah, they're on track, they're doing really well, I would advise start running some mock interviews with them, start running some mock professional discussions, whatever the assessment methodology is that's going to be used. And then if they're not performing well in those, they're probably not ready to go through Gateway. And the last point on there was just around the masterpiece, I guess. So apprenticeships, kind of when they were first evolved, it would have a period of on-the-job training, I guess, and then the very word masterpiece actually comes from apprenticeships, where the apprentice then would have honed their skills, they would know about the subject, they would have applied it, and then would create this masterpiece. And I guess what I'm trying to get across here is understand the significance and the importance of the endpoint assessment and make sure that the apprentice does too, because there are instances sometimes where apprentices, they might be late or they might not have prepared quite fully. So I think there's a really important balance to strike between, one, not completely freaking them out and making them panic about this experience, but two, it is a formal assessment and it is leading to the award of a qualification. So it's really important that they understand that and that they treat it with that respect and they plan and prepare for it appropriately. So the final phase is the endpoint assessment phase, and this is where the clock starts ticking. From a training provider point of view as well, this is where you're most likely to hemorrhage money, because, to put it crudely, because when you're planning out the delivery of the on-program piece, obviously that then dictates how the funding's kind of fed in via the levy. and it will be done on a monthly basis. And in essence, once the apprentice has got through Gateway, they're not on program anymore, but you're still required as a training provider to support them, and it's a very intensive period as well. So it's in everybody's interests that that endpoint assessment phase doesn't drag on, and in particular from that kind of financial point of view, because it's expensive to support an apprentice through that part, and you're not getting paid for it essentially. Planning the timeline and planning for contingency are really important. So what we'll do at DSW is when you go through Gateway, your assessor will make contact within 2 days, and then they'll book in a planning meeting. And I think it's important that that planning meeting is structured and that you have an honest appraisal and looking at the timeline for that particular EPA. So, okay, for example, there's a portfolio submission, and then there might be an interview later on. So planning it in so that actually, in the event that the portfolio fails, and it's a case of, plan for the best, prepare for the worst. So in the event that the portfolio is marked and it doesn't pass the first time, have you left enough lead-in time that you can cancel that interview, for example? Really obvious things like that. And what that means is, number one, you can make the timeline as short as possible, and number two, you don't get caught out through kind of cancellation fees or anything like that. Practice makes perfect, so make use of all of the mock assessment materials that are available. To be honest, if I were a training provider, I would probably, even if I was working with an EPA on a particular standard, I would probably try and get access to mocks from the other EPAOs, because if you can get them for free, why wouldn't you? It's all kind of learning experience for the apprentice, and all getting them used to what's going to happen in the EPA. And I think particularly for employers, ensuring that the apprentice has got the support they need is really important. So when they're in the workplace, are they being given enough time to actually prepare for their endpoint assessment? Are they being given the emotional support that they need? Because most of them will have things like interviews in, and not many people I know enjoy interviews, and that whether they're a young person in their first job or whether they're 50 years old, nobody really wants to go through an interview. So, are they mentally prepared for it, and are they being given the support that they need? Sticking to dates is absolutely essential. I think one of the good things about kind of apprenticeships and apprenticeship delivery is that they're super flexible. So you can onboard apprentices at any time. Within reason, you can take as long as you need to complete the program. You've got an endpoint assessment window. But I think that we are all human, and apprentices are human. And actually, if you don't have a particular date in mind to focus on, the tendency is that you won't focus on it. So I think setting dates is really important for apprentices, and trying to make sure that they stick to them. It keeps them focused. It makes sure that they're fully prepared when they go into the endpoint assessment experience. It's very easy to kind of let them slip and to say, okay, well, I'll give you a bit more time. But actually, in some ways, it's kind of like tough love. I'd be interested, Marcus, as well, to hear if that's been your experience as EPA.
Yeah, I think very much so. You have to take that sort of approach, and to be fair, I think they sort of respect that if you do take that sort of approach, because they know it's got to be done. We know there's always the issue with, well, I've passed my exams, is this other bit still important? So unless you have that consistent approach all the way through of exactly what needs to be done and by when, and you continue that right through to the end, then you're going to lose it. But and obviously, the longer it goes on, the whole point of this presentation today, the longer it goes on, the harder it is to maintain that commitment, if you like. So yeah, totally agree with that.
Thanks, Marcus. The final point for me on there is use the feedback. So I know that across EPAOs there's quite a disparity in terms of the amount of feedback you get and when you get the feedback, but certainly at DSW, for each of the assessment components that the apprentice completes, we will mark that, and then we'll give you feedback before they progress to the next component. And I would just say use that feedback, share that feedback with the apprentice, because it can be a really good motivator. So if they've done the portfolio and they're on track for a distinction, they will always go into that next component performing as well as they possibly can, because they want to get a distinction. Likewise, if it's been assessed and there are some gaps, you might want to focus on those gaps, because the likelihood is that when they go into a professional discussion or an interview, those are the areas that are going to be kind of focused on in particular, because first and foremost, what the endpoint assessor is going to want to do is they're going to want to satisfy themselves that that apprentice is competent and that they're competent against the whole of the standard. So if they've spotted any ambiguities or any areas of weakness, the first thing that they're going to do is target those and question around those to satisfy themselves that they're competent. Once they've satisfied themselves that the apprentice is competent, that's when they'll start looking at things like distinction criteria. So use that feedback to your advantage. It's a very useful resource. So in summary, I'll allow a bit of time still for questions. Timely completion is definitely of huge value to everybody involved for the reasons that we've looked at. From a training provider point of view, it frees up a load of resource that you can then use to focus on other apprentices in the system. It can save you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds per year. From the apprentice's point of view, they just want to get through the program. They want it to be a sleek, polished experience. They want to walk away with a certificate so that they can progress. From the employer's point of view, again, they want it to be sleek. They want it to be a good experience because they want other people in their organisation to take them up on the offer of doing apprenticeships. And again, they kind of want that person to be coming back into the workplace and sharing what they've learned and being a kind of productive employee. And that early engagement is absolutely critical. Recognise who all of the stakeholders are. And the way I describe it is that each apprenticeship is almost like a project. So you'll have your different stakeholders, you'll have milestones, you'll have a deadline. And I think it's important that you kind of approach it with that project management mindset and methodology. So contingency planning and all those sorts of things, and reporting into all of the stakeholders on a regular basis, because actually we can all help each other. So planning, scheduling, reviewing and revising are all absolutely critical, and that's not just in the EPA period, that's basically from day one of the apprenticeship for all of the reasons that we've looked at. And last but not least is involving the apprentice, because actually when they are bought in and when they feel like they've got ownership over their program, they're always more engaged, they always perform better, and they always have a more successful outcome. And that was it for me, really. I don't know whether you've got anything to add there, Marcus, before we move on to the Q&A.
Probably not. Happy to take questions, really, but I think that the key themes you've brought out, Jake, and I promise you, Jake didn't bring me on to say what I'm about to say, but as you can imagine, we've had experience with a number of EPAOs, and I do stress to everybody that one of the reasons we really like working with DSW is their willingness to listen and be flexible. And the feedback steps that Jake just shared with you, I think are hugely valuable if you're trying to motivate someone through those final stages. Having that feedback from, what can be a bit of an anonymous entity, this endpoint assessment organisation, I think really makes a big difference and motivates them to continue. And similarly as well, really urge you not to be afraid to get DSW involved. So an example would be recently with quite a prestigious client, we were doing level 6 financial services for the first time, which has got quite a complicated endpoint assessment, which we've never been through before. So we just arranged a 3-way meeting with ourselves and Jake and them, and just talked it all through and worked out how it could best be applied practically for that organisation. And that put not only their minds at rest, but our minds at rest as well. So I would certainly encourage you to do those things wherever you can.
Thanks, Marcus. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will run through some of the questions that have come through in the comments. Okay, so there's a question here: how did DSW avoid leading times and delays that the EPA backlog caused? So one of the approaches that we take, which I think is unique to DSW, is that we would assign the endpoint assessor on registration. And there's no reason not to do that, because we don't start charging the registration fee, and there's no financial penalty if that person kind of withdraws from the program before they get to Gateway. So what that means is that once you do get to Gateway, you've already got that assessor assigned. They know roughly that they're going to have some work coming at that point in time. And once you have that planning meeting, you can kind of get... So I think what happens with a lot of other organisations who I know have much longer kind of EPA periods than we do, is what they'll do is they'll wait till you get the gateway and then they'll assign an assessor. And then, of course, then you have to work out their availability and things like that. So I'm not saying that the way we've done it's always been perfect, but I do know from the data that we've looked at that we always complete, in average, EPA within 60% of the time that's outlined in the assessment plan. And I'm confident that we're doing a very good job of it and that we are always looking at ways to improve it. So we have made some changes recently in terms of the scheduling process and some real improvements which we'll be seeing over the next year. But actually, yeah, I think it's something that we've done very well and we'll continue to work in that way. And I'm surprised, to be honest, that other organisations don't do it in that way. I think we might see them start to do so, actually, because it's a common sense approach, really. When do EPOs assign IQAs is a question that came through. So we have IQAs, so internal quality assurers, who would effectively sample the assessment decisions of our independent assessors. So we kind of manage that in-house in terms of what the IQA strategy is and how we implement that and which assessors' pieces of work we would IQA. So we always assess an IQA work within a 5 working day SLA, and that's 5 working days from the date that was agreed with the assessor. So, for example, if you agree with the assessor, we're going to submit a portfolio on this date, then you can be sure that within 5 working days of that assessor will have completed it. If for any reason that SLA isn't met, then obviously let us know and then we can chase that up. But certainly that's our SLA and we hit it more than 90% of the time. Another question, our apprentice is on course to complete the 20% of the job within 9 months. Is this okay? Yeah, that's absolutely fine, provided over the course of their apprenticeship from day one to the gateway, the total is 20% or more. That's totally fine. We don't actually police that or monitor that at all in terms of 20% off the job. So we wouldn't know whether or not an apprentice has actually had 20% off the job. Ofsted will monitor that, and also the ESFA will monitor that. So Ofsted look at it in terms of, did the off-the-job training deliver value? Did it deliver what it was supposed to in terms of quality and outcomes? And the ESFA will monitor it in terms of, did you actually hit the 20% in terms of the hours? Because that's a funding issue. And I don't think that we have any more questions. One might have just came through. Yeah, just one last question's come through. So are timely rates measured from Gateway or EPA? I'm not sure what that means. So the way that we've measured it in terms of the data that we've got is the on-program would be from the date that the apprentice was registered onto the ILR to the date that they hit Gateway. And we would measure the duration of their EPA period from the day that their Gateway documents are approved and signed off to the day that they complete their final assessment component. I hope that answers the question. So it looks like there aren't any more questions, but if you do have any more, feel free to kind of get in touch and we'll be more than happy to answer them. And I'll leave Marcus to have the final word.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Jake. Very happy to do this. If anyone has got any other questions that they think afterwards, via Jake, very happy to still get involved in responding to those. But I think I probably already summarised my thoughts. I think it's really about the work that gets done pre-induction, and at induction, which is the really critical bit. If you get those bits right and everybody understands from the start exactly what everything that's required and the commitments that everybody has, rather than sort of worrying about later on. I'm sure people aren't doing that anymore, but I think there's a bit of that going on at early doors with the apprenticeship programs. I think that's the critical thing, really. So we spend a lot of time now pre-induction making sure that everyone really, really understands exactly what's involved, whether that's the 20% or whether it's the how the EPA works and the timings, and then of course that's reiterated in the actual induction itself. So that would be my strong message, I guess.
Fabulous. Well, thanks very much, Marcus, for your time today, and thanks everyone for joining us and sticking through to the end. Like I say, if you do have any questions as a follow-up to this, get in touch and we'll be more than happy to help you. So have a great day, everybody, and thanks again for your time. Take care.